The rope goes taut in your hands, and the cliff face tears your palms open, and you don't stop climbing. 100 feet. Vertical chalk. Above the English Channel. Bullets snapping past your helmet like something alive. The man below you, you don't know his name, stops moving. The rope shudders. Then goes still. You keep climbing. This is Pointe du Hoc. June 6, 1944. And somewhere at the top of this cliff, there are guns that could kill 10,000 men on the beaches below. You have to reach them first. 2 weeks ago you were in Scotland. Rain. Cliff drills. Rope burns that never fully healed before the next session tore them open again. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder pushed you harder than any man had ever pushed you in your life, and somewhere between the exhaustion and the anger, you trusted him completely. You understand why now. The plan was this. Pointe du Hoc is a rocky headland jutting out from the Normandy coast, sitting exactly between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. On top of it, the Germans had placed 6 155mm artillery pieces, howitzers, with a range of 25,000 meters. That means every Allied ship in the channel, every landing craft, every man waiting ashore on D-Day, all of it, within reach of those guns. Allied planners ran the numbers. Those 6 guns, if they fired during the landings, could decide the entire invasion. So the mission fell to 225 Rangers. Your mission: land at the base of the cliff, fire grappling hooks to the top, climb 100 feet of near vertical rock under enemy fire, neutralize the German garrison, destroy the guns, all before the beaches could succeed, all before the world changed. The mission brief called it difficult. The Rangers who heard it used different words. You shipped out from Weymouth on the evening of June 5th, packed into a landing craft assault with 20 other men. The English Channel was rough that night. 4 to 6 foot swells. Cold spray coming over the sides and sheets. Half the men around you were vomiting before you cleared the harbor. You held your M1 Garand across your chest, stared at the hull, and tried to think of nothing. Here is something the history books sometimes leave out. You were 19 years old. Most of you were. Kids from Tennessee and Pennsylvania and Texas, sitting in the dark, crossing the most dangerous stretch of water in the world, heading toward a cliff held by battle-hardened German troops who had months, to prepare for exactly this moment. And there was one more thing you didn't know. One detail that intelligence couldn't confirm. The guns might not even be there anymore. The boats were supposed to hit the base of Pointe du Hoc at 6:30 in the morning. They hit at 7:08. 38 minutes. On a mission time to the second, 38 minutes was a catastrophe. A navigation error had sent the lead craft toward the wrong stretch of coastline. The entire force had to correct course, running parallel to the cliffs in open water, in full daylight, under fire from German troops who could now see you clearly. 2 landing craft were swamped by the waves. Men drowned before they ever reached the rock. 1 supply boat, carrying extra ammunition and the long extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, went down entirely. The pre-invasion naval bombardment that was supposed to be suppressing the cliff top had stopped, because the schedule assumed you'd already be climbing. When the ramp dropped and you hit the water, it was cold enough to knock the breath from your body. The strip of beach at the base of the cliff, barely 25 yards of rock and rubble, was already cratered, tangled with wire, and covered by German fire from above. The man in front of you went down before he hit the water. You stepped over him. You had to. That's what the training did to you. It removed the pause. There was no freeze. There was only movement, because movement was the only thing standing between you and the men depending on you. The grapple guns fired. Rocket-propelled hooks trailing rope, arcing up toward the cliff edge. But the ropes were wet. Heavier than the launchers were calibrated for. Half the grapples fell short. They clattered back down the cliff face, tangling, bouncing, some landing on Rangers below. Sergeant William Petty, the men called him Elrod, stood near you. He looked at the cliff. He looked at the wet rope in his hands. And then, without a word, he started climbing with his bare hands. You watched him for exactly 1 second. Then you followed. The chalk was slick. Your boots found holes that disappeared. Your hands bled from the rope and then from the rock itself, and the cold made them feel like they belonged to someone else. Above you, a German soldier appeared at the cliff edge with a rifle. He fired. The man to your left, 6 inches to your left, stopped moving. You didn't stop. The noise was like nothing you'd been told to prepare for. The USS Satterley and the HMS Taliban had resumed fire in support, and every shell sounded like God tearing a piece of sky apart. The cliff shuddered under your hands. Chalk and dirt rained down on your face into your eyes. Screaming in German above you. Screaming in English below. You were halfway up a 100-foot cliff. completely exposed. And for the first time with absolute cold certainty, you understood you might not reach the top. Your hands hit flat ground. You rolled over the cliff edge and lay there for 1 second. Just one. Just breathing. The plateau of Pointe du Hoc spread out in front of you and it looked like the surface of the moon. Every square yard cratered. Raw earth thrown up in ridges and walls of chalk and dirt that gave you cover but also took away every landmark, every line of sight. No straight lines. No clear paths. Every direction looking exactly the same. Small arms fire, everywhere. Scattered. Coming from multiple directions at once. The German garrison hadn't been destroyed by the bombing. 200 men from Grenadier Regiment 726, dispersed into bunkers and shell craters, fighting back from every angle. You moved, crater to crater, low and fast, M1 Garand in your hands. The way you've been trained, 5 yards, drop, 5 yards, drop, covering ground without standing up any longer than it took to get to the next hole. The first gun casemate was empty. Not abandoned. Empty. The mounting rings were there. The concrete walls. Spent shell casings on the floor. German equipment scattered around the base. No guns. You checked the second. Empty. The third. Empty. A specific kind of dread settled into your chest. The dread of a mission suddenly without a target while men were still dying behind you on the rope. What you didn't know, what no ranger on that headland knew yet, was that Allied intelligence had been both right and wrong at the same time. The guns existed. But on April 25th, 6 weeks earlier, after weeks of sustained Allied bombing, the Germans had moved them. All 6 155mm pieces relocated to an orchard near the village of Grand Camp, 1 mile inland. Hidden under camouflage netting. Still operational. Still loaded. Aimed at Utah Beach. Right now. At approximately 8:15 in the morning, Sergeant Len Lommel and Sergeant Jack Kuhn were pushing south through hedgerow country when Lommel spotted tire tracks in a dirt path. Fresh ones. You followed them. You found the guns. All 6. Arranged in a hedgerow-lined field. The German crews had left them, possibly to take cover from the ongoing naval bombardment. For a window of minutes, no one knows exactly how long, 6 artillery pieces capable of breaking the D-Day landings were sitting in an orchard, with no one watching them. Lommel had thermite grenades. You used them. 2 guns destroyed. Back to Ranger lines. More grenades. Back to the orchard. 4 more guns destroyed. 6 guns. 2 sergeants. 20 minutes. The threat to the beaches from Pointe du Hoc's artillery was finished at approximately 8:30 in the morning of June 6, 1944. But you're still on the headland. Still in the craters. Still fighting. German counterattacks begin almost immediately. The garrison probes from the south, from the east. Ambushes in the broken ground. Close quarters fighting at 10 yards, 20 yards. Sometimes hand-to-hand in the narrow communication trenches. You fire at shapes. At movement. At muzzle flash. Clip empty. That sharp metallic ping as the end block ejects. Reload. Of the 225 men who launched this mission, roughly 135 made it to the top of the cliff. The rest were killed or wounded on the boats, in the water, or on the rope. You are 135 men holding a cratered headland against 200 defenders, with no reinforcements coming until the beaches are secured. And Omaha Beach is not secured. By noon, ammunition is running low. Radio contact with the fleet cuts in and out. Twice, German infantry pushes so close that Rangers fight them off with rifle butts and knives. Colonel Rutter, shot twice during the assault, refusing evacuation, sends a radio message to the Allied fleet at 9 in the morning. 3 words. Praise the Lord. The prearranged signal meaning, we are on top. The cliff has been taken. And unspoken beneath those 3 words, something Rutter would never say out loud on an open radio frequency. We are alive. For now. The afternoon of June 6th became the night of June 6th. The night became the morning of June 7th. The fighting continued. The craters became your world. Every shadow a threat. Every sound a decision. No relief came. June 8, 1944. Dawn. You have not slept. You have been in this crater, 12 feet across, 4 feet deep, for 48 hours. You know every stone in it. You know the smell of it. Cordite and wet chalk and something else you've learned not to name. Your M1 has fired so many rounds the barrel is hot to the touch even in the cold morning air. You have 6 rounds left. You know because you counted them in the dark, by feel, with hands that don't feel like yours anymore. The German counterattack on the night of June 7th was the worst. 3 separate assaults from the south. 1 from the east. An armored car disabled by a ranger with a bazooka at close range. You lost men you knew. Men whose faces you can still see. You heard Sergeant White call out once, on your left flank at 3 in the morning. And then nothing. You didn't let yourself think about what that silence meant. You couldn't afford to. Not yet. By dawn on June 8th, Colonel Rutter counted his able-bodied men. 90. Out of 225. And yet, the guns were destroyed. The headland was held. The German artillery that could have broken D-Day never fired a single round toward Allied ships. Because 2 sergeants walked into an orchard and did what a full company with air support was supposed to do. At 9 in the morning you heard them before you saw them. American voices. The specific rhythm of American cursing. Then olive drab uniforms moving through the craters ahead. Men moving low and fast the way you've been moving for 2 days. One of them dropped into your crater. He looked at your face. At your hands. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Just looked at you the way someone looks at something they weren't sure they'd ever see. Then quietly he said it. You Rutter's Rangers? You didn't answer right away. You were looking past him, out across the cratered moonscape of Pointe du Hoc. At the empty gun casements on the cliff edge. At the English Channel beyond them, still full of Allied ships. Still there. Still pushing the invasion forward. Still alive with the movement of 10,000 vessels that the guns above this cliff never got to touch. Still there. Because of you. Because of 225 men with grappling hooks and rope and the absolute refusal to stop climbing. Yeah, you said. He nodded slowly. The way someone nods when they've heard something they needed to hear. Your hands were shaking now. They wouldn't shake during the fighting. They shake now in the quiet with no target and no decision and no next thing to do except sit in this hole and breathe. That's how it works. Here is what the record shows. Of the 225 Rangers who launched the assault on Pointe du Hoc on June 6, 1944, only 90 were still combat effective when relief arrived on June 8. 135 men killed, wounded, or missing in 48 hours of continuous fighting. A casualty rate of 60%. Among the highest of any American unit in the entire Normandy campaign. The 6 guns they were sent to destroy, 2 sergeants destroyed all of them with thermite grenades in approximately 20 minutes, before most of the cliff assault force had even consolidated on the headland. Every ranger who died on that cliff after 8:30 in the morning, died holding ground that contained guns already destroyed. They didn't know that. They held anyway. Colonel James Earl Rutter was shot twice during the assault. He refused evacuation. He directed the defense from a shell crater until relief arrived. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Years later, he became the president of Texas A&M University. He never talked much about Pointe du Hoc. Men who were there often don't. Sergeant Len Lommel received the Distinguished Service Cross. He went home to New Jersey, became a lawyer, and lived to be 91 years old. Decades after the war, he returned to Normandy. He stood in the orchard where the guns had been. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The cliff at Pointe du Hoc still stands. The craters are still there, preserved exactly as they were on the morning of June 6, 1944. If you visit, you can stand at the edge and look down at the rock in the water below and understand, in your body, not just your mind, what those men did. The wall is sheer. The drop is brutal. And they climbed it anyway. On June 5, 1984, 40 years to the day after the assault, President Reagan stood on this ground and looked at the aging Rangers seated before him. Men who had actually been here. Men who had actually held the rope. And he said, "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc." He paused. "These are the men who took the cliffs." The Rangers sat very still. They had been 19 years old on this ground. They had climbed a 100-foot cliff under fire with bleeding hands, because someone had to, and because they were the ones who were there. Sergeant William Petty. Sergeant Len Lommel, Sergeant Jack Coon, Colonel James Earl Rudder. These men were real. This happened. They didn't do it for monuments or speeches or anyone telling their story 80 years later. They did it because the man next to them was climbing, and because the guns had to be silenced, and because when the rope was wet and the grapple fell short and half the men around them were already down, they chose to keep moving. That choice held the cliff. That cliff helped hold the beach. That beach helped hold everything. If this story reached you, if you felt even a fraction of what they lived, look up their names. Len Lommel, Jack Coon, James Earl Rudder. Read one thing about them that wasn't in this video. Subscribe. Share it. Every view is one more person who knows what happened on this cliff on a cold June morning when 225 men grabbed a wet rope and refused to let go. The rope goes taut in your hands. You don't stop climbing.